Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished leader, a professional, and a businessman, originally from Serbia, but talking to us today from Seattle, USA, Aleksandar Babic. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Really appreciate.
Thank you.
I love your podcast,
Thank
and
you.
being here is an honor.
Thank you. Alex is an artist, he's a diplomat, and he's a businessman. So, Alex, my first question for you, how did growing up in Belgrade shape your worldview and artistic sensibilities?
Well, the growing up in Belgrade, Serbia, laid the foundation really for both my worldview
Hmm.
and my artistic sensibilities. My family was spread around across all the former Yugoslavia, and our frequent travels through Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro exposed me to diversity and I would say, beautiful complexity of
Mm.
the Balkan culture.
Yeah.
As far as the worldview is concerned, Yugoslavia at the time was one of the leaders, and some of you may know, of the non-aligned movement,
Yeah.
together with India
Correct.
and Egypt and
Yeah.
Indonesia and the other countries,
Yeah.
which in my mind, I would call it the BRICS of those days.
Correct.
That movement was one of the inspiration for me to pursue
Yeah.
diplomacy and to travel around. Although to go back to your question, life in Belgrade, at the time it was the capital of former Yugoslavia, was really a core who I became.
Mm.
I was also shaped deeply by my parents. My dad leaned towards leftist and I would say
Mm.
communist ideals, while my mom is deeply religious and
Mm.
compassionate person.
Mm.
And kind of a growing up between those two worlds taught me that I could be independent from how should I call it, imposed cultural
Mm.
boundaries,
Yeah.
yet still find belonging within the culture that formed me. And that balance between the freedom and identity is what drives my art, my
Mm.
work, trying to
Absolutely.
challenge the convention between
Mm.
the Orthodox Christianity and communism, and
Correct.
just kind of a little briefly for the people that don't know the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula is in southeastern Europe, embody really the complexity. The region combines the, should I say, tragedy of the Greek drama, the stubborn strength of figures like, I don't know,
Yeah.
tennis star Novak Djokovic, the provocative visions of performance artists like Marina Abramovic,
Mm.
that raw energy music, really from punk rock to country music over there, really kind of shaped who I am. And all of that continues to really inspire my artistic expression
Absolutely.
and and the worldview.
And we were there 2 years ago on a holiday in Serbia, and it's such a beautiful country, and spent some time in Belgrade. But Alex, tell me, what were your earliest creative influences uh, before you became a multimedia artist?
As a kid, I loved comic books, like in the magazine of former Yugoslavia called Stripoteka,
Hmm.
and the comic book series Alan Ford, just to name a couple. Only later on in my life, I learned about the term sequential art.
Mm.
You know, uh, Sequential art is the deliberate arrangement of juxtaposed images in a specific order
Mm.
to convey information, to tell the story, and produce an effect. That information and the effect doesn't have to be comical, doesn't have
Mm.
to be a joke. It can be serious, profound,
Yeah.
and thought-provoking. And that's why I have three artists that I can think of. Number one is Joe Sacco and his graphic novel about Palestine. Then there was another graphic novelist, Guy Delisle, a French Canadian, and he had books about Shenzhen, China, and Jerusalem.
Mm.
And then there was, of course, a graphic novel Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And that was one of the, they are the artists that showed me that this medium of graphic novels are much more than just entertainment in the
Mm.
comic books. It really combines with the images that tell the story in a sequential way.
Wow, wow. And you are such a multifaceted individual that going to be jumping between your various interests. But tell me, did your time as the diplomat in Myanmar and Thailand influence your perspective on humanity and conflict?
Humanity, as I'm listening to humanity, I latch on a humanity.
Mm.
They're difficult, and the conflict are difficult topics. But when I
Correct.
think about Myanmar, I'll stay focused on Myanmar because that's where I spend most of the time as a diplomat for former Yugoslavia. The main word or topic that overcomes the conflict is the humor,
Mm.
joking. And I'll explain. Southeast Asia, in my mind, is a lot like a Balkans of the
Correct.
Eastern Asia.
Mm.
I love that region.
Mm.
The most interesting place is that part of the world. The place where I would feel friendly, accepted, engaged, and sometimes silly, and sometimes a meaningful conversation.
Mm.
You know, on the silly side, I remember being with at that time, I remind you that's like a 90s, early 90s. I would talk with it was a party and or kind of a meeting, and I had a conversation at that time. Secretary one of the Myanmar junta, General Kin Nyo, and we were together with the Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng.
Mm.
And I had a kind of a serious conversation, but from a standpoint of the others, it was like a joking. I mean, we did
Mm.
did have a few drinks, but I was and Quino was telling me, "Oh, you've been here so long. We'll have to give you a passport.
Mm.
You'll have to become a Myanmar citizen."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
of course, we were joking and laughing. And Chinese Prime Minister, who was a great supporter of Myanmar, the military junta at that time, he was looking at us like, "What are these guys, talking about?"
Yeah,
And we were like, "Yeah, we're from the Balkans.
yeah,
We
yeah.
have the same sense of humor."
Mm.
That's kind of on a silly side, but on the meaningful side,
Mm.
I have my dear friend still in Yangon, Ma Tengi.
Mm.
She's an artist, an author, wrote a book called Nor Iron Bars a Cage.
Mm.
And Ma Tengi was a political prisoner, imprisoned by the same military junta and the
Mm.
Kinyo I mentioned on a silly part. You know, and that book was a true inspiration for me. It describes how Matengi and her fellow prisoners found ways
Mm.
to create a sense of community and maintain their spirit using shared resources, humor, jokes, and
Mm.
subtle acts of protest,
Mm.
despite the horrible place.
Yeah.
That was it. But humor was the key,
Mm.
and she told me that humor propels you really to survival. And Matengi told me many times that she actually had a good time in prison. Sounds weird.
Mm.
I had a good time in prison, but yeah,
Mm. Mm.
lots of laughs, and she learned a lot. And her book reminds me a lot about a movie, Life is Beautiful,
Mm.
with Roberto Benigni. I think he won the Oscar for that. Guido character in the movie constantly joked and used wit to maintain a sense of normalcy and fun for
Mm.
his son, even amidst the grim reality of their surrounding. Because at the
Mm.
time in the movie, I don't know if you've seen the movie, they were in a concentration camp,
Mm.
and Roberto Benigni's character kind of through his spirit actually help himself and his son to survive. So I guess
Yeah.
going back to answer your question, humor can overcome conflict and
Correct.
help humanity.
Very well said. Great response. Let's now move on. What inspired you to start the Shelf of Sorrow project? And how do you decide which tragedies or locations to depict on the shelves?
Yeah, that's I mean, key question for the people that know my project. My think about it. So it's kind of, I would think that kind of a being close to a horrible place. You know, the horrible place is, where is somewhere where you actually live or somewhere where you travel,
Mm,
but then you don't necessarily know that that horrible place has
mm,
happened a few years ago.
mm,
Um, these shelves, they're objects, that you can hang on a wall,
mm,
and they depict places like Auschwitz and Jasenovac
mm,
concentration camp, during the Second World War, Slang Museum of Genocide in Phnom Penh,
mm,
Cambodia,
mm.
Rakhine State in Myanmar, and the
Yeah,
expulsion of the Rohingyas, places in Bosnia like Srebrenica
yeah.
and Kravica villages from the
Mm,
last war,
mm,
Marias River in the state of Montana in the U.S. And one of the shelf, and mind you, I did this, 2015, and one of the shelf was about Gaza in
mm,
Palestine, which the story unfortunately is still going on.
mm,
You know, some places and events in this collection might be historically or geographically connected with each other.
mm.
However, the only genuine connection is that I have a personal emotion attachment with each of them
Yeah.
through my life, my travels, my friends and family. That's why I have not included other places,
Mm,
like gulags of Siberia or
yeah.
Rwanda. I have not tried to rank these places from the standpoint of perceived historical importance,
Mm,
number of people that die there,
mm,
or try to quantify amount of human pain generated in one of those places. Each shelf has its own story. And, each shelf is an opportunity to learn and ask ourselves why.
mm. Amazing, amazing. I was reading about the shelves of sorrow, and it's amazing how much I could do a whole podcast with you on just
Oh,
one
yeah.
item, which is the shelf of sorrow. But tell me also about the story behind My Name is Peter Babich from the village of Sovyak or Sovjak. I'm not sure how to get the pronunciation right.
It is a Soviet, but it's
Sovyak.
okay.
Yeah.
It's a historically, this is the graphic novel I did and published in 2016.
Mm,
And the story is about during the Second World War, in 1941, but
mm,
also later when Germany invaded former Yugoslavia, they created a Nazi puppet state of Croatia.
mm,
And they created a multiple concentration camps where they were taking mainly Serbs, but also Jewish people and Roma people and
mm,
anti-fascists. And this is actually my family story because my grandfather was killed. My father was kidnapped from his family
wow. Mm,
and to be converted into Catholicism, and my grandma was taken to Jasenovac concentration camp, which she managed to escape from. But
mm,
how did that story, it's a family story, but it's a history. How did that become a
mm,
novel? I was visiting Yad Vashem, a museum of in Jerusalem, and at the very moment I was looking at the name of the Jasenovac concentration camp on one of the presentations, my phone rings. And I see who's that? Oh, my daughter is calling me from the U.S. and she was in here in Seattle area in
mm,
Snohomish High School, and she was asking me, Dad, I would like you to come and tell the story about our family, and
mm,
because the school was doing a different presentation about a Second World War. And first I was like hesitant. It's a tough story, but okay, I'll do it.
mm,
So I brought a bunch of maps, pictures, and stories, and I came and
mm,
I was talking to high school kids.
mm,
And I was expecting high school kids, they're going to be on their phone,
mm,
whatever. This guy is talking. They were very engaged.
mm,
Some of them were crying. And after the presentation, I got all kinds of letters. Says, sir, you have to do this. You have to do a movie. And one of them made a drawing and said, you have to do a graphic novel. And I said, okay.
mm.
Okay, I'll do a graphic novel,
Mm.
and after that, actually, those kids from Snohomish High School helped me to tell the story of
How
Serbian
interesting.
children in the Second World War.
How amazing. And then this became a part of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes, it is. The book is in part of the archive.
Wow.
I feel that, we need to preserve the history, and to do
Correct.
that, we need to have established institutions like Holocaust Memorial
Mm.
Museum in DC. This is a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it really inspires people and leaders, I hope leaders, worldwide to
Mm.
confront not just anti-Semitism, but all kinds of hatred,
Correct.
hatred, against the Palestinians these days, or prevent extermination and
Yeah,
promote human dignity.
correct.
Having my graphic novel to be part of the archive is a gift to all the children, not just
Mm.
Serbian kids from Kosovo
Yeah.
region, but all the kids that are extracted from their everyday life and taking into custody, and the museum, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, is really a great institution with
Mm.
lots of records. I actually, even after I published the graphic novel, in the archive, I think I found a picture of my dad when he was in one of the concentration
Wow.
camps.
Mm.
And because all kinds of documents are there, this is a very, very important institutions. And I hope we continue to support that institution.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. What, in your view, Alex, are some of the biggest barriers to empathy in our societies? And how can art nurture empathy in such a divided world?
Well, it's really, I think, all kinds of tribalism, nationalism is really the kind of, it stops us to feel the empathy, because when we
Mm.
fight each other, we're thinking just to win. And it's very hard. So I think there's some kind of a empathy being part of the education, and not just the education of one or two countries, but really of
Mm.
the world. That could be a way to go. And art can be inspiration. Art can be a visual, or all kinds of art can
Mm.
be a path towards that feeling of the
Mm.
empathy.
Mm.
At least I, I,
Well
I hope
said.
that.
Well said. Well said. But tell me, when you work on such heavy themes, how do you protect yourself emotionally?
You can't.
I agree.
The whole point is to shift your brain between
Correct.
different modes of
Yeah.
feelings,
Yeah.
going between empathetic mode of putting yourself in the skin of the victim, or skin of
Mm.
the perpetrator, really, of the crime, to the mode intellectually musing about nature of the crime, or just putting the historical context.
Mm.
I, you know, you need to kind of sometimes think this way or that way, otherwise it can get overwhelming, and
Mm.
I don't think you can protect yourself.
I agree. I agree. What patterns have you observed in the cruel races for survival between people, ideologies, and states?
I think that that pattern is the same over and over again.
Hmm.
Fear, destruction, and creation of the mythology. What I mean by that, you feel threatened, or you tell your tribe. By the
Hmm.
way, we all have tribes.
Correct.
Feel threatened in countries, businesses, and
Hmm.
you know, and then you act to win. And this, when you win, you have this luxury to create a history
Hmm.
based on your own narrative.
Hmm.
And so, unfortunately, loser doesn't make the history. And this
Hmm.
is all kinds of a pattern, and sometimes culturally later on that changes. But this is the same pattern happening over and over again. And, in
Hmm.
some of the Shelf of Sorrow project, you
Yeah.
can see who is the winner, and you can see some of that. I've tried to kind of articulate that on some of the objects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And really, this pattern is I had, ideologies or nationalism or other isms, but really that's going more than that.
Well said. Alex, how do you balance depicting painful truths with offering hope or solutions through your work?
Well, it's I have Huh. In some of the, in Shelf of Sorrow, how I did that, I did in my graphic novel, but let me just stick on a Shelf of Sorrow. So it is a visual art, so it's an object. So in vertical part of the shelf, in most of them, I created the image where I would try to wake up empathy in the people that look in this.
Mm.
Example is the shelf of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
So on a vertical part of the shelf, I have an image that I took in a Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt, Germany, where
Mm.
there is a name of a certain person, when he was born and when he died.
Mm.
And then the one you are thinking, what were his desires? What did he want to become? What was, did he have a girlfriend? You're thinking about this person specifically, and that kind of creates the empathy. But on the horizontal part of the shelf, I did the drawing of the Hitler's writing and his kind of thought Arbeit macht frei, like
Mm.
the sign that was in Auschwitz concentration camps, and kind of try to explain visually the ideology that created this evil, and kind of having both vertical and horizontal in the one object.
Mm.
I have tried to kind of do the story about
Mm.
that. Um, so that's kind of how I
Yeah. Yeah.
separated empathy
Yeah.
from history a little bit.
Amazing. But when you're dealing with such politically sensitive subjects, do you ever struggle with self-censorship?
Oh, of course. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't self-censorship is something that we do every day,
Correct.
regardless of the business,
Yeah.
art, family matters. When operating and working on a business side, I don't know, let's say on a business, you know, you are thinking, am I going to lose the big account? Like, I don't know, last year I was in a party, donor party for, at that time, governor to be Bob Ferguson in the state of Washington, where I live. And, we had a pictures, and I think, should I post this picture on LinkedIn or not?
Mm.
Now, if I, as a businessman, had a big client that was a Trump supporter,
Mm.
maybe I wouldn't. I don't know. But this thinking, and by the way, we're all tribal in every country. So
Correct.
it's same. What are you going to say at the dinner with your family, with your uncle that you disagree
Mm.
with?
Yeah.
Are you going to, and especially with the shelf of sorrow,
Yeah.
am I going to offend my friend in Myanmar? Am I going
Mm.
to offend my family in Serbia?
Yeah.
So this is constant thought. This is a constant
Absolutely.
struggle that happens
Absolutely.
everywhere.
Absolutely. I have time for two more questions for you.
Okay.
Do you believe humanity is learning from past atrocities, or are we repeating them in new forms?
Yes, but they're not learning the lesson we think.
Hmm.
So I'm going to quote one great guy, Noam Chomsky. He
Hmm.
famously stated that the true lesson of the Holocaust is not simply that a monstrous crime was committed,
Correct.
but how millions of ordinary Germans were
Hmm.
convinced that
Hmm.
it was required. He asserts that education is crucial for learning how to spot the sign of history repeating itself.
Hmm.
And, unfortunately, as we see, history is repeating itself
Yeah.
over and over again. Another great philosopher of mine that I feature actually in my Shelf of Sorrow project, his name is Freddie Perlman. He says, there is no earthly reason for the
Hmm.
descendants of the prosecuted to remain prosecuted when nationalism offers them the prospect of becoming prosecutors.
Yeah.
It really means that lessons we are learning, not empathy, but we're learning to be prosecutors.
Right.
And because of that, that's why I think the only way to ultimately go over this cycle is some kind of education in empathy.
Well said. And my last question to you, if you could leave one message for humanity through your body of work, what would it be?
Oh boy. For me, empathy is not just a spiritual or woo-woo kind of a prayer
Yeah.
thing. This is, I believe, an existential question. It's about
Hmm.
survival of the human race. And that is, it's imperative imperative for us to overcome the challenges we face. Many folks said that, not just, one that I quoted. And I think that we can do it. I really think humans are capable to survive. And there are actually scientific evidence for that. I really think, I don't know if you read the book called Humankind by
No.
Rutger Bregman. Bregman discusses how archaeological evidence, specifically the discovery of the cared for bones, suggests that early humans were collaborating and taking care of each other
Yeah.
rather than just brutally killing. He contrasts this with a killer ape theory that prevailed for decades, saying that humans were killing each other only. No, they were taking care of each other,
Correct.
because if they found those bones, they died, but they had a lot of broken bones that were healed early in their life. So that means they had their family, their
Yeah.
friends to take care of each other. So I think, again, scientifically, there's evidence that we can care about each
Absolutely.
other.
Absolutely. But on that note, Alex, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation this has been. I mean, you've lived through some of the most challenging countries and yet some of the most beautiful countries. I've been to your country. I've been to Myanmar several times. I've been and seen the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I've seen what the atrocities that happened in Auschwitz and Birkenau and so on. Thank you for sharing with me your amazing journey. Thank you for sharing such incredible perspectives through your work on humanity and empathy. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.